Hi everyone, welcome to a new episode of the Expert Talk series. My name is Nikita Nambiar, and I'm the founder of Mind Matters magazine, and I'm extremely delighted to announce that Mind Matters magazine will now be under the ownership of the Brainiac podcast, which is a neuroscience and psychology podcast initiative I co-founded with two other friends. So make sure to check out our new content at the Brainiac podcast on Instagram, as well as our old magazine content and new content that obviously we'll be uploading now, including our blogs, and this episode of the Expert Talk series on our YouTube channel and on www.thebrainiacpodcast.org, which is the website where you can find all things neuroscience and psychology related. So I'm going to give you guys some context into who the amazing person that I interviewed today was. Her name is Professor Bojana Zupan, and she's an associate professor of psychological science and a director of the Neuroscience and Behavioral program at Vassar College. I've had the honor of being able to be mentored and to have worked under her, and in both a professional and personal capacity. She's one of the most incredible women I've met in my life. Dr. Zupan runs an active research lab investigating the impact of genetic and environmental factors on the development of behavioral traits associated with disorders such as ADHD and autism. And in this episode of the Expert Talk series, we go into depth on topics related to ADHD, autism, research into neurodegenerative disorders, STEMinism in the 21st century, and something that's especially important to me, how to pursue a career in neuroscience or STEM as a woman in STEM. So without further ado, let's go on to the episode. I was so honored to be able to speak with her, and I hope you guys enjoy it. Welcome everyone to episode 7 of Mind Matters Magazine's Expert Talk series, Mind the Brain. I'm joined today by Professor Bojana Zupan. Thank you for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the invite.
So, yes, we'll just start it off with a bang. At your lab, Zupan Lab, you do some incredible work studying the neurodevelopmental basis of affiliative social behaviors. And I'm sure our audience would love to learn more about the work that you do there. So if you wouldn't mind, could you speak a little bit about that, the research that you do, and the conclusions that you've derived from your research?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I always found fascinating is this idea that, so many of mammalian species are actually a social species, and that we are not really evolutionarily, right, developed to survive optimally as individuals, right? We rely on our immediate social environment, be it both the parental or siblings, maybe potentially extended family, depending on sort of the details of how social structure of any specific species is set up, but we rely on them, right? And so the overall idea being that if we are, from just a purely evolutionary perspective, going to argue the propagation of genetic material, that it behooves these social species to cooperate, right? To support, so affiliatively interact with members that are close, genetically close to themselves. And so there's a reason why, again, so many species are actually social creatures and rely on this sort of fundamental structure to essentially, propagate their genetic material and really sort of meet that definition of evolutionary fitness, right? And we see this sort of in many, as I said, different species. So humans are not that different from a lot of these social species. And so we think of ourselves as also social. We even, individuals who may be, let's say, more introverted are still, members of a social species. And we grow up, right, under the protection of our families. We interact with our siblings. We might, even sort of like our friends potentially better than our families, but we still have this this constant connection to individuals that share our genetic material. And so when we think about these sort of social constructs and social motivators, it is interesting to think that, again, they're so sort of conserved across multiple species, But we also see them sometimes in very interesting ways potentially become maladaptive, right? So instead of furthering and improving fitness and survival and functionality of an organism, sometimes, like any behavioral trait or any system, it gets pushed a little out of whack in ways that drives behavior in a way that doesn't necessarily do all the things that I just said are beneficial. And so that's the part that I'm really interested in, right? So I was trained in a medical school, a PhD program in a medical school. So I always think about the human impact of the research that I do. And for me, when it comes to affiliative social behavior, sure, it is a fundamental component of our species and many others that are social in nature. But in humans, it's also a well-defined and described core symptom of a number of conditions that we diagnose, specifically neurodevelopmental conditions. And some of the ones that I would immediately sort of rattle off, of course, autism spectrum, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, and a number of other sort of again, sort of behavioral abnormalities that at the core of its symptoms have potentially either the inability to engage in a socially appropriate and functional way, or on the other hand, not being unable to, for example, detect social cues that then appropriately guide behavior. And so that's kind of where my interest really sort of arose, to sort of say, okay, I'm fascinated about this sort of universal behavioral profile that humans have that I think is truly sort of, beneficial and fascinating, and obviously selected for by evolutionary pressures. But in humans, we see it sort of, again, go awry, become maladaptive. And in that respect, I think it's fascinating to sort of learn a little bit about the basic science, but also study sort of the abnormalities so that potentially we can improve lives of humans who are in ways unable to engage in this sort of fundamental way with their fellow members of the species.
I think that's incredible and definitely really important work. And I have now a question regarding like ADHD and other neuro developmental disorders. So when we look at how much research is being done on it, yes, there are many papers being published and a lot of conclusions being drawn, but do you think it's enough? Is there a possibility to maybe unlock the biological basis of what's happening during these neurodevelopmental diseases?
There is quite a bit of work being done. It's actually fascinating when we look at funding, at least in the United States. A lot of the public funding of research is done through the National Institutes of Health, particularly as it relates to diagnosable conditions. More basic science research can also be funded through the National Science Foundation, or NSF. And then anything that is particular to a disease state in humans, oftentimes there's some sort of an association, an NGO, non-governmental organization, that can also try to recruit donations or private money to help aid research with a very specific objective towards that clinical condition. So there's actually quite a bit of work being done. And we do see a discrepancy with certain conditions in terms of overall amount of funding. But I don't think necessarily that there isn't enough being done in the realm of neurodevelopmental disorders, particularly because I think as sort of empathetic human beings, we see individuals at the start of their life. We want them to be successful. We want the best for them. And so neurodevelopmental disorders at the start of a young individual's life almost seem to be an affront to that expectation for sort of human life and equitable access to success and happiness. And so I think it's not that hard to motivate both funding agencies as well as researchers to really sort of think about neurodevelopment as something that is sort of an affiliate of social behavior, right? Sort of let's support this to help others. So I think there's quite a bit done. Could there be more? Always, right? There could always be more funding. There could be always more labs, research questions. But I'm actually quite pleased with sort of in the last few decades. It's actually been quite astounding in the amount of information we have gained about particular conditions, diagnosed conditions, and the underlying factors that might actually drive them. Some may be treatable, others may be modifiable, right? But one or the other is still better than being completely at a loss for how to help individuals diagnosed with certain conditions.
On that note, actually, so I like to think of that just as plastic as our brains are, neuroscience too is a very plastic field, and there's constantly new information coming in, new papers, like he said, and a lot of new data, new information. And along those lines, is there a research paper that was recently published that piqued your interest, that's doing this really interesting work? And can you speak about that paper for us?
Yeah, well, I can actually speak about a paper that we just read in my lab on Monday. So we have weekly meetings, and in addition to sort of covering administrative things about the runnings of the lab, we always have a journal club. So either myself, but mostly the students in the lab will select a paper that they think is interesting, and they will discuss it, or we will all discuss it together, talking about not just the methodology and the results, but sort of, the reasons behind those experiments. What were the questions? What do we gain, right? What do we as scientists and as people gain from the process that was undertaken to inquire this new information or acquire this new information? So this particular paper wasn't necessarily new. I think it was it's a couple of years old. But it underscores this really fascinating convergence between a variety of factors that can impact development of an organism. So to sort of get into the nitty-gritty aspect of sort of my interest in neurodevelopment, I particularly find interesting the idea that we have a convergence of genetic and non-genetic factors that can affect how the nervous system develops. And a lot of times we think of, let's say, a genetic mutation, right, occurring at a particular point prior, let's say, to fertilization, and through Mendelian genetics inherited, let's say, a recessive gene, 2 alleles of a recessive gene, and now we have an organism that now has some sort of a physiological, neurobiological abnormality leading to certain symptoms. I mean, sure, that's definitely a well-known and well-established fact. But it's not necessarily true for a large majority of these neurodevelopmental conditions that are seen to be modifiable or at least influenced by a variety of factors. So autism, for example, we know is 40 to 70% likely, right? 40 to 70% associated with genetic risk factors. But there's no single gene that accounts for more than a few percent of that risk, right? So what that indicates is that that the genetic component, the genetic risk to autism, is a polygenic risk, right? It's likely that multiple genes with a variety of functions can modify some system or maybe influence a critical period of development to yield these sort of what we would consider core symptoms of autism. So if it's not one gene, that is a yes or no mutation, right? It doesn't mean that if you have it, you have the condition. If you don't have it, you're safe, right? But rather something that increases probability and risk for developing it. And if it's only accounting for 40 to 70%, that means that anywhere between 30 and 60% is not genetic, right? So what is this other thing? Is it truly a genetic risk? Is it an environmental? Is it a combination of both? Do you have to have one genetic risk factor and then on top of it an environmental one in order for it to become a risk factor? And maybe independently, they're not at all individually, right? Detrimental. That's the part that I find fascinating, because ultimately we back in the 80s and 90s when sort of the genetic revolution came about, some of the sort of overly simplistic optimism was rooted in this idea that, now that we can read out the human genome, we have a blueprint, we have a map, and we're going to figure out everything. And then we discovered, right, it is a blueprint, but there's so many regulatory levels of how that map is read out that essentially it's good to have a map, but that's just a starting point. And so what I actually sort of find fascinating in sort of the most recent research is individuals who can merge the two, because that's kind of also my own interest. What is the genetic predisposition, and then combine with an environmental one to at times yield something that is greater than the sum of its parts. So to get to your question, right? That paper that we just read looked at how the intestinal microbiome of an organism communicates with the brain during a critical period of development to set up abnormal social behavior. So this was done in mice. And what they ended up doing was they actually took a genetic mouse model of autism. They took an environmental mouse model of autism. And then they took what they called or referred to an idiopathic, or a model of autism or mouse model of autism that doesn't necessarily have any known cause for its or behavioral pattern, but it has it, right? And across these three different groups, one genetic, one environmental, one who knows, a little bit of everything probably, they measured the intestinal microbiome. And they noticed that there were certain bacteria, species of bacteria, that were actually dysregulated in animals that were showing these abnormal social behaviors. And the amazing thing was when they supplemented during sort of basically the mouse adolescent period, these bacterial species, they could reverse the social deficits in these animals when they were adults, right? So remember, these animals came from parents. When they were young, they were, sort of just like any mammal. They're dependent on their mom. They're drinking. They're nursing. They're being groomed, right? They're exposed completely to that environment. And then at a certain age, in mice, that's 3 weeks of age, the animals are separated because they're considered old enough to be able to feed and drink on their own. And then there's about a month-long period where they're considered adolescents before they become sexually mature. So during that adolescent period, they just supplemented with this bacterial species. And it didn't matter what the risk factor for these abnormal social behaviors was, genetic or environmental or unknown. These supplementation with these bacteria actually reversed the deficit, which is fascinating. It suggests that the whole convergence, right, of genetic environmental is somehow being modulated by the intestinal microbiome. And they went actually one step further, and they asked the question, okay, well, if bacteria in the gut are so important, how are they communicating all of this to a brain that's still developing during the adolescent period, but one that isn't necessarily in any way that we can yet identify, continuously directly communicating with the gut? There is one way that there is communication, and that is one of the cranial nerves called the vagus nerve, which innervates the viscera and actually projects into the brainstem and targets a number of, goes into a number of different areas, projects into a number of different regions of the brain. So they hypothesized that maybe these bacteria somehow interact with this vagus nerve in the viscera, right, in the intestine, and somehow induce activity patterns, do something. This is the part that they didn't really address, but somehow changes the activity of this particular nerve, and maybe that's the way that they lead to changing behavioral patterns in adult animals. So the experimenters simply snipped the nerve, and they gave these animals the bacterial supplementation all over again. And take a guess, what happened with their social behavior? Do you think it was reversed, or do you think it stayed the same? It's a 50-50 guess.
Did it get reversed?
It didn't reverse, which meant the bacteria in the gut change behavior by changing the pattern of activity of this vagal nerve. So it doesn't matter if the brain and its development are modified by the genetic factor associated with autism, or the environmental factor, or this idiopathic one. One way to rescue the sociability of every one of those models is to stimulate the vagus nerve with this particular type of bacterial species that usually occurs in animals that don't have any one of those risk factors associated with autism. And that was really fascinating. That was actually, it's not a novel paper, but it does actually, again, underscore this idea that, these neurodevelopmental conditions that have complex behaviors like social behavior as a core symptom really reflect a disturbance in the circuitry and the dynamics and the development of brain regions, rather than a single on-off, have it, don't have it sort of neuropathology. And it makes it even much more exciting to know that you can actually manipulate the central nervous system by intestinal microbiome composition. So that's an exciting area of research, and I'm eager to see how far we get on that front.
That's definitely interesting. I have never heard of bacteria being able to influence, behavioral change,
Yeah.
and that too in the gut. You wouldn't really draw a conclusion or any connection between that if you first think about it. And I think that kind of brings me to the beauty of neuroscience. This is you're merging microbiology with cognitive sciences, and in the same way, the cognitive sciences as a whole is just an intersection of a bunch of different fields, right? I have a podcast with 3 friends, and we all describe neuroscience as being the ultimate science because there's a little bit of physics, there's math, there's
I won't argue with that, although I am biased.
But yeah, there's a little bit of everything in neuroscience, and that brings me to the next question I have to ask you. So this ambiguity of neuroscience is what really interests me, but I'm sure there's something else. There's another aspect that drew you into wanting to understand, neurodevelopmental diseases more, and what was that? What was your calling factor for this?
I was a weird child. I was always a nerd, very proud of it. But I actually only realized that I must have had some inherent draw towards thinking about brain and behavior, because only after I graduated college, I was speaking about my 7th grade science project, which means I was 12 years old, with my undergraduate major advisor. We were flying from New York to California to attend a conference, the Society for Neuroscience. And I was going to present my undergraduate thesis there. So I was really nervous, but really excited. And we happened to be on the same flight, and we were sitting next to each other, and we were casually talking about a variety of things. And I brought up this story, and he just looked at me and he said, well, you were just born to do this. And so the story is as follows. In 7th grade, I was 12 years old. I sort of thought about what I wanted to do my science project on, and exploding volcanoes and all these types of things were not necessarily my thing. So I decided, and I always loved animals, so I decided I wanted to build a maze and train mice to run through it. And I would then, I wanted to test what would happen to their ability to complete this maze if they got drunk. So I remember going to the pet store with my mom, buying 3 little white mice, and then in my garage, putting together a maze that looked more like a labyrinth than anything that we would use for behavioral testing now. And I trained these little mice to go from point A to point B, and with baiting the maze so they would learn how to go through it. And I trained them, and I even had the parameters of what I called memory and coordination. So memory, I looked at how many errors they made from the easiest path from the start to finish of the maze, and coordination was how long it took them to go from point A to point B. So I trained all the mice to do this in under 5 minutes, and then because I was 12, I wasn't allowed to touch alcohol. My mother essentially poured some vodka into the water bottle for these poor mice. There was no control group. We don't know how much they drank. We know they drank because most of them just slept the next day. But again, I was 12, and my mother is in the she's a professor, but she's an anthropologist, so she couldn't really help me devise an appropriate control group. But the next day, I took the little 3 mice and I put them through the maze, and only one made it through. Basically, the other 2 curled up in some corner of the maze and just fell asleep and wanted nothing to do with it. And such, I concluded that alcohol affected memory and coordination in mice, and probably shouldn't drink it too much. So that's basically a good indicator of where my mind was, even as a 12-year-old. Just fascinated about what, how are the things that affect behavior, and obviously in some ways, what are some strategies to quantify things, to have them measured, to have them, in some way representable other than from a subjective sort of individual perspective. And so that was really a driving force for me. I remember when I applied to colleges, I applied only to schools that had biopsychology programs. I really was just fascinated by this idea of understanding why animals and humans, right, as we are animals, they do what they do. And it was actually in college where I had a slight shift in the interest, in that I started out really focused on sort of ethological work, observational, naturalistic. How do animals do things in their environment and why? And then I took one course. It was essentially a physiological psychology course, and it had an associated lab where we got to tinker with the brain, and we injected animals with pharmacological agents. We actually did a surgery. We did a brain surgery. I remember I was 19 or 20 years old, and I called my mom. I was like, I just did brain surgery. And all of a sudden, this whole new world opened up where I realized I don't have to just observe. I can actually test any hypotheses or ideas that I have about why I observe the things I observe. By using, there's a bit of a give and take, right? You can't do it with complex animals, but maybe in animal models, you can go in and you can change variables. And, it's a give and take in terms of the validity of what it is that you're looking at. But the draw to being able to tinker with something basically under the hood, right? I could not resist. And I've never really looked back.
I feel like that's such an inspirational story. And with all the experts that we've had so far, I see that all of your starting points come from such incredible places. Our last expert that we had on, she got interested in neuroscience because of a book that she read. The one before that, she didn't want to do the sciences because both her parents were involved in the sciences, and then she decided to attend a class and realize that she really liked neuroscience. So it's amazing to see where all of you start from. And along that note, as a woman pursuing a STEM field, how important do you believe representation is, especially in neuroscience? And do you think that there are enough women pursuing it? What are your thoughts on that?
Huge and yes. So I think having not necessarily role models, but mentors in whom you can identify in your own life trajectories, your own hurdles or privileges, I think is really important. So diversity at the level of the student body cannot really be expected or encouraged if there's no diversity at the level of the mentors who guide and support those students. It's really hard to sort of commit, I think, to STEM fields because they do require, even in college, those are the classes on Friday mornings when everybody else is out on a Thursday night, on a thirsty Thursday. It's usually the science majors who are getting up for bio at 9 o'clock in the morning, right? So, that sort of commitment to your own intellectual curiosity is internal, but it's always really nice to have external support. And we usually gravitate in terms of support to people who we feel identify with us or who understand us. And so, again, I think that's what's huge, to have diverse scientists who are willing and eager and actually good at mentoring. Sometimes there's nothing worse than an eager but bad mentor. You just kind of don't just walk away. Just walk away. I'll do it by myself. But the unfortunate reality is, at least, again, and I'm speaking more from a U.S. base here, that there's still a generational shift. And even though there are, in the life sciences, we're seeing more at the undergraduate level, more women earning life science degrees than men. In graduate schools, we're seeing an increased number of female PhD candidates, of female postdoctoral fellows. They haven't overtaken the male counterparts, but they are substantially larger in number and representation than even a decade ago. Where we're not seeing that is in the higher positions, in positions of tenure track, endowed chairs, heads of institutions, of programs. Those who are actually in positions of power and influence are still, quote unquote, the old guard. But I'm hopeful that that's something that's in the process of changing. I mean, I think any fundamental change is truly a generational one, and it doesn't happen quickly. And so we've packed, right, the K through 12, undergraduate, and now graduate levels of education with women and individuals of other diverse and oftentimes underrepresented backgrounds. They just haven't yet come up to those levels of power. And there may actually, at that point in time, now be the real struggle, which is breaking through the barriers that are kind of systemic in these institutions, and be this academic or a pharmaceutical, biotech. We can even talk about hedge fund and finances, looking at basically the markets and capital investments in biotechnology, right? In those areas, it is still male dominated, and so there has to be a shift. Hopefully, I do believe that we're moving in that direction, that will now represent in those positions of power the actual representation at the educational level, which I think we've done very well on, but we haven't gotten there yet. It's that last big hurdle left, but we're moving in that direction, and we just got to keep going.
I agree with you on that. And as you see, like, the generations passing on, if we look at even how Gen Z is taking up major issues of today, we see a change. And I think it's great that that change is being brought out, and that we're working towards a better future and a more supportive future, and one that accepts all. It sounds like a utopia, but yeah, hopefully we'll be able to attain that one day. As a concluding thought, though, do you have any advice for aspiring cognitive scientists or STEMinists, very cliche term, but STEMinists who are watching this video?
I would say, don't ever doubt yourself. Don't ever feel intimidated by someone else. There's a term named imposter syndrome that I think is prevalent in academia, and particularly in the STEM fields. And I fear that it is a self-imposed cage for a lot of people. And this isn't just for women. Most individuals, I think, who are highly educated, the one thing they're very good at is recognizing what they don't know. And unfortunately, a lot of us ascribe the level of what we don't know as being a lot more than the person next door. And so I think it's a challenge for women to be able to speak out and be completely okay with even saying, I don't know, and to never sort of allow ourselves to sense that somehow we are the imposters, that we are somehow inferior, right? It's sort of the assertion of what we do know should be the number one motivator, rather than the avoidance of what we don't know and sort of hiding behind that. And I think as long as we are forward with sort of speaking out, confident in what we know, and yet open about what we don't know, there's no reason why we should feel inferior or even place ourselves in these sort of self-contained boxes that in the past have been imposed on us by other external means. So I would say just speak out, be confident, and at no point feel like allow yourself to feel that you are somehow by default less capable than someone else who just happens to be louder or more aggressive or more basically a science bully.
That was amazing. And that brings us also to the end of our video today. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. It was incredible speaking with you. And I hope our audience loves this video, which they definitely will. Thank you.
I'm happy to do it. And you know what? I'm really thrilled that you're doing something like this. I think it's really important to communicate the variety of experiences of particularly female scientists to the up-and-coming generation, because there's no single path. Everybody figures it out on their own. And as long as you trust yourself, then you'll get there.
Thank you so much.